palliative care unit. Spring of 2005. The air in the hallway was thick, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the inevitable quiet that precedes the end. But room 312 was different. As I pushed the heavy oak door open, the sterile smell of the hospital vanished. It was replaced by something thick and suffocating. She smelled of lavender and basement mold. It was a scent that didn't belong in a modern medical facility. It belonged in the bottom of a cedar chest, buried under a century of dust. I remember the sound of my own shoes on the linoleum, a rhythmic, hollow clicking that felt far too loud for such a quiet space. Clara was sitting up in the bed, her back as straight as a soldier's, despite the tubes snaking into her arms. Her hair was a marvel, snow white and combed so perfectly it looked like spun glass. She didn't turn her head when I entered. She just stared at the window, watching the spring rain streak across the glass like tears on a cold face. I pulled the metal chair closer to her bedside. The screech of the metal legs against the floor was a sharp, jagged protest in the silence. I sat down and felt the weight of my Bible in my lap, the leather cover cool and worn against my palms. I've sat with hundreds of the dying, but Clara felt like she had already been dead for a very long time. There was a coldness radiating from her, a stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. She finally turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were gray, the color of a winter sky just before the snow falls. They were sharp, too sharp for a woman of 90. They didn't hold the fog of dementia or the softness of old age. They held a terrifying clarity. She looked at my collar, then at my face, and she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had won a long, exhausting war and was finally ready to survey the ruins. The plastic of her oxygen cannula hissed softly, a steady, rhythmic whistle that filled the gaps in our silence. I asked her if she wanted to pray. She laughed, a dry, rattling sound that turned into a cough, a sound like dry leaves being crushed under a boot. She reached out with a hand that looked like a bird's claw, her skin so thin I could see the blue map of her veins pulsing underneath. She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her skin was ice cold, even in the heated room. She told me she didn't need a prayer. She needed a witness. I can still feel the dampness of that afternoon. I can still hear the distant chime of the nurse's station and the muffled groans of the heavy machinery keeping the floor alive. I leaned in and the smell of mold grew stronger. It was the smell of damp earth, of darkness, of a place where the sun never reaches. She began to speak, her voice a low, melodic rasp that felt like a secret being whispered in a confessional. She talked about 1944, the year the world went mad. She talked about a man named Julian. I watched her lips move, thin and pale, as she described the way the light used to hit his dark hair. She held a photograph in her lap, her thumb tracing the edges of the frame over and over again. The friction of her skin against the old paper made a soft, shushing sound. It was the only sound in the room besides the hiss of the oxygen. She told me Julian was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. That was the word she used. Owned, not loved, not cherished, owned. As a chaplain, you learn to listen to the words people choose when they are standing on the edge of the Great Divide. They stop lying, or more accurately, they stop lying to themselves. Clara was finally telling the truth, and it felt like a cold wind blowing through my soul. She told me how the recruitment officers came to their town, how the drums rolled and the flags flew. She told me how the fear of losing him started as a small seed in her chest and grew into a strangling vine that choked out her reason. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I looked down at her hands, those ancient, spotted hands, and realized she was holding the photograph so tightly that her knuckles were white. She began to describe the cellar of her childhood home, the stone walls, the way the humidity would make the salt rise to the surface of the bricks like white crust, the darkness that lived down there, thick and permanent. I realized then that she wasn't mourning a soldier who died in the trenches of France or the forests of Germany. She was talking about a ghost she had created herself. I felt the urge to stand up, to walk away, to leave that room and its smell of mold behind. But I couldn't move. I was anchored by the sheer weight of her confession. I find myself thinking about her often when the sun goes down and the shadows in my study grow long. I think about the choices we make in the name of love and how easily devotion can curd into something unrecognizable. I looked at Clara, this frail, dying woman, and I didn't see a grandmother or a saint. I saw a jailer. How much of what we call love is actually just a desperate fear of being alone? Palliative Care Unit, Room 312, midnight. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed with a low electric vibration that seemed to rattle the very bones of the building. Inside the room, the shadows were long and jagged, stretching across the linoleum floor like reaching fingers. Clara had stopped looking at the window. Now she looked at me, and I felt as though I were being weighed on a scale that only she could see. Her breathing was a shallow, rhythmic rasp, the sound of a dry brush on a canvas. She began to describe the first night, the night she led Julian down the stairs. It was 1944. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the distant, low rumble of the train station. She told him the military police were on their way. She told him someone had seen him, had reported him as a deserter, though he hadn't even left for the front yet. She painted a picture of a firing squad in the town square, of a cold gray cell where he would rot if he stepped outside his own front door. I watched her face as she spoke. There was no shame there, no regret. Just a terrifying clinical precision. She described the way she had prepared the cellar. She had moved a narrow cot down there, a small wooden table, and a single kerosene lamp that cast a flickering amber glow on the damp stone walls. She told me Julian was trembling, his eyes wide and trusting, like a dog seeking shelter from a storm. He believed her. He believed her because he loved her, and because fear is a much stronger tether than truth. As she spoke, I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. I thought about that young man, Julian, 24 years old, strong, sharp-jawed, full of a life he was about to surrender to a lie. She told me how she turned the heavy iron key in the lock that first night. The sound of the bolt sliding home was a final, definitive click. She said it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of him never being able to leave her. The weeks turned into months. The months turned into years. Outside, the world was moving. The war ended. The soldiers came home to parades and kisses. The 1950s arrived with their neon lights and chrome. The 60s brought a new kind of chaos. But in that cellar, time didn't flow. It stagnated. It became a thick black pool. Clara described the routine she kept for 40 years. Every morning she would cook a double breakfast. She would place his portion on a tin tray, the metal clinking softly against the ceramic mug of coffee. She would walk down those 13 wooden steps, each one groaning under her weight, a familiar, tired protest that Julian came to recognize as the sound of his only connection to the living. She told me about the smell down there. It was the smell of damp earth, of unwashed wool, and of a man slowly turning into a shadow. Julian would ask about the war. He would ask if the police were still looking for him, and every day for 14,000 days. Clara would look him in the eye and tell him the world was still a dangerous, burning place. She told him the streets were filled with men in dark coats waiting for him. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of nausea. I had to look away from her, toward the small plastic cup of water on the bedside table. My throat was dry, like I had been breathing in that cellar dust myself. I asked her, my voice a low, cracked whisper, if he ever tried to leave, if he ever fought back. She laughed then, a soft whistling sound. She said that after the first 5 years, he stopped asking to see the sun. The darkness had become his skin. He was afraid of the light. He was afraid of the very air outside that door. She had convinced him that she was his only savior, the only thing standing between him and a violent end. I realized then the depth of the horror. This wasn't just a woman hiding a lover. This was a slow, deliberate erasure of a human soul. She had sculpted a man out of silence and lies until he was nothing more than a ghost who still required a meal twice a day. She described how his hair grew long and gray, how his skin turned the color of a mushroom, pale and translucent. He became a creature of the cracks in the wall. The monitor next to her bed let out a sharp, rhythmic beep, a reminder of the mechanical heart beating inside her. I looked at the photograph in her lap, the one of the young Julian. His hazel eyes were so bright, so full of a future that had been stolen from him by the very hands now holding his image. I thought about the silence of that house for 40 years, the way the neighbors must have thought she was a lonely, grieving spinster, never knowing that a few feet below their feet, a heart was beating in the dark. I find myself wondering about the weight of a secret like that. How do you carry the life of another person in your pocket for 40 years without being crushed by it? I looked at Clara, her white hair glowing in the dark, and I saw the strength of her obsession. It was a monument to a love that had rotted into a cage. I sat there, the weight of the Bible in my lap feeling like a leaden stone. I thought of the countless times I had spoken of devotion, of the beauty of a love that endures all things. But standing in the presence of Clara's confession, those words felt hollow. They felt like a mockery. I felt a deep, piercing sorrow for Julian, for the man who spent 40 years waiting for a war to end that had finished when he was still a young man. Does a heart that is kept in a cage for 40 years still know how to beat for itself? Or does it only beat for the one who holds the key? Hospital room 312, 2 hours before dawn. The rhythm of the hospital had shifted. The frantic energy of the day shift had long since evaporated, leaving only the low hum of the floor's machinery and the occasional soft, rubbery squeak of a nurse's shoes in the corridor. Outside, the spring rain had turned into a thick, clinging mist that obscured the world beyond the glass. Inside, Clara's voice had grown thinner, a dry rustle of wind through dead grass. She was reaching the end of her story, and I could feel the cold weight of it settling into my own marrow. I felt a deep, gnawing ache in my chest, a spiritual exhaustion that no prayer seemed to reach. She told me about the winter of 1984, The pipes in the old house had frozen, then burst, sending a slow, icy flood into the basement. She described the sound of the water, a relentless metallic dripping that echoed against the stone walls. Julian was 64 then. His lungs, weakened by decades of damp air and the lack of sunlight, began to fail. She described the sound of his breath, a wet, rattling struggle that she could hear through the floorboards of her living room while she sat knitting by the fireplace. I asked her if she felt pity for him then. She looked at me, her sharp gray eyes narrowing, and she said that pity is for the weak. She felt a proprietary fear. If he died, her world would end. If he lived, she had to keep the secret. She told me how she went down into the rising water, her own joints aching with the cold, to bring him blankets and hot tea. She described the way he looked at her in the dim glow of the kerosene lamp. His eyes were huge, sunken into a face that was the color of a blanched almond. He didn't ask for a doctor. He didn't ask for the police to take him away. He just asked if the war was over. I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye, and I didn't wipe it away. I just sat there, the rough leather of my Bible cover pressing into my thumb. She told him the war was still raging. She told him the world was a blackened husk, and that the only safe place left on earth was that flooded, freezing basement. She lied to a dying man with the same breath she used to tell him she loved him. The cruelty of it was so absolute, so pure, that it felt like a physical blow to my stomach. The end came on a Tuesday morning. The rain had stopped, and a pale, watery sun was trying to break through the clouds. Clara had gone down with his breakfast, but the tray didn't click against the table this time. She found him sitting on the edge of the cot, his head slumped forward. He was gone. She described the silence of that moment. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of the basement she had known for 40 years. It was a hollow silence. The ghost was finally a ghost. She didn't call the police. She didn't call a funeral home. She told me, with a voice that held a terrifying pride, how she spent 3 days cleaning him. She washed his sallow skin, trimmed his long, wild gray hair, and dressed him in the wool military overcoat he had worn the night he went down the stairs in 1944. She said he looked like a soldier again. She said he looked like he was just waiting for a parade. Then she told me about the garden. Behind the house, under the old oak tree where they used to sit when they were children, she dug. She dug for 2 nights straight, the shovel biting into the frozen earth with a sharp rhythmic crunch. She described the blisters on her hands, the way the mud caked under her fingernails. She dragged him out of the basement in the dead of night, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes in the cold air. She said the moon was full, a bright, uncaring eye in the sky. It was the first time Julian had been under the stars in 4 decades. I looked at Clara's hands, those spotted, fragile things, and I pictured them dragging a dead man across a moonlit lawn. I pictured her covering him with the cold earth, patting it down until the ground was flat again. She lived in that house for another 20 years, walking over his bones every time she went to hang the laundry. She never married. She never left the town. She stayed with her prisoner until the very end. She finished her story and closed her eyes. The tension seemed to leave her body all at once, leaving her looking smaller, more sunken into the pillows. I stood up, my legs stiff and heavy. The weight of what I had heard felt like a physical burden, a dark stain on my soul that I knew I would never be able to wash away. I had come to offer her comfort, but I was the one who felt hollowed out. I walked to the window and looked out at the mist. I thought about Julian. a man who spent his entire adult life in a box because he trusted the woman who claimed to love him. I thought about the thousands of days he spent listening to her footsteps above him, thinking the world was on fire, never knowing that the sun was shining and the birds were singing just a few feet away. It wasn't love that kept him there, it was a sickness that wore love's clothes. As I left the room, I didn't say a prayer for Clara. I couldn't find the words. Instead, I whispered a prayer for the man under the oak tree. I prayed that wherever he was now, the light was so bright it blinded him to the memory of the dark. I walked down the hospital hallway, the clicking of my shoes sounding like the ticking of a clock that had finally run out of time. I still see her face when I close my eyes. I see that sharp gray gaze and the perfect white bun. I see a woman who mistook possession for devotion and built a monument out of a man's life. Every time I pass an old house with a dark basement, I feel a shiver of recognition. We all have basements in our hearts, places where we hide the things we are too afraid to lose, but at what cost? If you have to break someone's spirit to keep them by your side, do you really have their heart, or do you just have their shadow?